Ukrainians fight to defend the sovereignty of their country, and in the eyes of many in the West, they are also fighting and dying to defend European values. But who will guarantee the country's future security? Will it be the EU, or rather the United States? Can Ukraine even be a full member of the Western military alliance, NATO? Or is joining the North Atlantic Treaty Organization just a pipe dream for Kiev?
It's not about whether Ukraine deserves or not. It's like whether all the others deserve Ukraine aspiring at.
Definitely. Ukraine should be in NATO, but a nation at war is not going to be admitted into the alliance.
We should now rather focus on helping Ukraine win this war and push the Russian troops back.
The African states will only want to support a mediated diplomatic solution to the crisis.
We are here at NATO headquarters in Brussels, and right behind me you can see the colorful national flags of all the NATO countries. Ukraine thinks it's only a matter of time before its flag will be raised here too. But that could bring the alliance into direct conflict with Russia, something officials here say they want to avoid at all costs. So where will Ukraine's ambitions for joining NATO lead? And what could the results look like? We are going to walk you through 3 scenarios. Number 1. A roadmap to NATO. Olha Stefanishyna strains every sinew to make it happen. She is Ukraine's Deputy Prime Minister in charge of Euro-Atlantic integration. Ever since Russia's full-scale invasion last year, she's been making regular trips to Brussels, lobbying hard to convince officials here to give her country a path toward NATO membership.
We have proven as a country that we are a reliable partner, even being in a full-scale war.
Without Ukraine on board, over the table, it's literally impossible to shape any kind of security strategy.
We are standing and advocating for the momentum this decision should be taken, and this momentum is now.
It's not about whether Ukraine deserves or not. It's like whether all the others deserve Ukraine aspiring at.
After all, Ukrainians say they are already fighting with all kinds of Western-made weapons. They have been trained by NATO members and proven themselves as the first line of defense for Europe. After all, they had been waiting for the door to NATO to open for many years, even before Russia decided to use that aspiration as a pretext for its full-scale invasion. Back in 2008, leaders from NATO member countries gathered at a summit in Bucharest, Romania, and made a historic declaration. This is what they said.
NATO welcomes Ukraine's and Georgia's Euro-Atlantic aspirations for membership in NATO. We agreed today that these countries will become members of NATO.
But when exactly, and under what circumstances? These important questions remained unanswered. And there hasn't been much movement on them since then. Why? Jaap de Hopshefer was NATO Secretary General at the time.
When NATO leaders at this meanwhile famous summit in 2008 welcome Ukraine aspirations but stop short of inviting Ukraine to begin accession talks, was it a mistake?
It was on balance. It was a compromise, and a compromise is never the ideal, but this was less than the ideal. Although I admit immediately I had to defend it as Secretary General, because this was what President Bush, Chancellor Merkel, President Sarkozy of France, they agreed upon.
But you were unhappy with the outcome?
Well, in those days, in 2008, I thought this is the best compromise we could think of. But the problem with that compromise was, in the words of my friend Kurt Volker, former NATO ambassador and special Ukrainian representative for Ukraine, we left Ukraine in a grey zone. And Kurt Volker rightly says, grey zones provide green lights. A country in a grey zone like Ukraine was considered by Vladimir Putin as a green light. He invaded Georgia in 2008, August. He invaded and annexed Crimea 2014. He attacked full-blown war in February 2022. Grey zones are green lights, and we should never let that happen again.
In 2008, it was Germany and France in particular who advocated against Ukraine joining the alliance for fear of provoking Russia. Today, allies again debate over how, when and if Kiev should be invited to join the club. And Germany is once again among the more cautious NATO members.
Honestly, I can answer this question here and any place for the 20th time. There are clear statements from NATO that Ukraine has its future in NATO. But it is also clear to all concerned that the admission of a country that is at war is simply out of the question. That must be clear to everyone, because then NATO would be a direct war party. No one can really want that.
But Berlin isn't alone. Washington too is cautious about Ukraine's potential membership. And even Ukraine knows it cannot get NATO membership while a war is raging on its territory. Here's why. NATO nations take a collective defense pledge to protect each other in case of an attack. This promise, known as Article 5 of the NATO Founding Act, is at the heart of the alliance. The shield Ukraine is striving for, but also its biggest barrier to entry.
A nation at war, not its own fault, but a war of aggression by Russia, is not going to be admitted into the alliance, because that would mean that Article 5, and again, an attack against one is an attack against all. Article 5 would apply and NATO would be directly at war with Russia. And that is something which is not going to happen.
So instead, what NATO could offer Ukraine is a roadmap to membership, spelling out what it needs to do to join the alliance, or making clear the accession comes directly after the end of the war. It's what many of Ukraine's biggest political backers, among them Poland and the Baltic countries, are pushing for.
Estonia has always been on that position that the best or the only guarantee for Ukraine is NATO membership. And why is very clear, that Russia has said many decades that they want to create buffer zones. They want to create grey zones between Russia and NATO. And our counter message has always been that there cannot be any grey zone between Russia and NATO, and every country has the freedom to decide, and NATO has the open door policy.
From Polish perspective, Ukraine should be member of NATO alliance. Why? Because it's proof of our common security, and of course we need to be united. So that's why we are open to discussion about this. In my opinion, we should present a path to reach this goal. And I hope that during a meeting, NATO meeting in Vilnius, this path will be presented.
Timeline, maybe?
Maybe timeline.
Many think this option, a roadmap toward membership, is the best Kiev can hope for within the current political constraints. It is also seen as a likely scenario here in Brussels. But it also puts a heavy burden on Ukrainian forces, because if they don't win the war, gaining NATO membership will remain out of reach. And that's why some think that Ukraine should give up on its NATO dream and entertain the possibility of another scenario. 2. Neutrality of NATO. If Ukrainian forces were to lay down their arms, could this be the best solution to a deadly conflict which continues to claim lives? NATO was formed in the aftermath of World War II, an alliance of North American and Western European states forged to deter threats from the Soviet Union. Decades later, after the Cold War, nations once imprisoned behind the Iron Curtain also came knocking at NATO's door. It was then that the alliance gained a sizable eastern flank. But there is another way. Some European countries have chosen never to join NATO and instead pursue military neutrality. Countries including Austria, Ireland and Switzerland all have policies of non-alignment, sometimes written into constitutions with aims of avoiding overseas conflicts, others hoping to avoid confrontations with troublesome neighbors. Russia has traditionally seen NATO's growth as a threat to its own security, something the alliance denies. The Kremlin has long claimed that if NATO was to definitely shut its door to Ukraine, the invasion would end.
Today we must proceed based on the fact that an expansion of NATO, development of its military infrastructure near the Russian borders, is one of the potential threats to the security of our country.
Former NATO chief Jaap de Hopsheffer thinks this demand has its roots in events that happened long ago.
I think what drives Vladimir Putin is an obsession. And that obsession goes back to 1989 when the Berlin Wall fell. Everything he stood for fell apart. And he wants to reinstate and resurrect that world, which is the world of ideally the Tsarist Empire, the Soviet Empire, you name it. That is what's driving him.
But it's not just Russia that would favor Ukraine laying down arms. South Africa-based researcher Priyal Singh says many nations in the global south are also weary of NATO.
Many African states look at the example of the 2011 NATO-led intervention in Libya as something that African states must guard against. Further beyond our borders, many African states are very acutely aware of the kinds of developments that surrounded the 2003 US-led military intervention in Iraq and so on.
And with that in mind, they are pushing for a swift end to the conflict with an African peace initiative.
Following the recent African peace mission to Ukraine and Russia right now, we saw that, the exclusive focus of this mission was to pursue negotiations and a mediated solution, a diplomatic solution to the ongoing Russian invasion of Ukraine. I think that is the only approach that African states and many countries in the global south would want to willingly, officially endorse and support.
But for Ukraine, that could mean giving up territory and giving in to an unjustified land invasion. The country's deputy prime minister Olha Stefanishyna is spending her days convincing other countries not to ask Kiev to back down.
If Russians saying if Ukraine will be neutral, we're not going to attack you, it's just the words, as one of the brightest Russian writers were saying, which are not worth even of paper it's written on. So if there's like this kind of discussion, it justifies the war. It justifies the war, the crimes, the attacks against civilians, killed and wounded people, and all the massive massacre we have, throughout the war.
Shocked by the brutality of Russia's war on Ukraine, more and more of the country's partners in the West understand that choosing neutrality will not protect Ukraine from any new Russian aggression. Instead, behind closed doors, the US and some European nations are frantically working on security assurances they could individually offer Ukraine.
Such assurances would not mean those countries would come to Kiev's aid in case of a new attack, but they would provide Ukraine with weapons, advanced technology, training and money when needed. And there is something else which could sweeten the deal: Ukraine becoming a member of the European Union. Though full membership won't be easy to achieve, Kiev is already on a path to joining the EU. That would transform Ukrainians' lives with unlimited access to travel, work and business opportunities across the bloc. And Ukraine has already fulfilled some of the conditions Brussels says it must meet to enter the club.
It is impressive to see that despite a full-blown war, Ukraine is working hard, tirelessly and intensively on the 7 steps. A lot of progress has been made, but work has to continue.
For now, the West looks unlikely to ask Kiev to negotiate with Moscow, especially not without clear concessions from Russia in return. But it's not entirely out of the question, especially if the war drags on and Russian forces keep occupying Ukrainian territory. And that leads us to our last scenario.
3. Left in the West's waiting room. Time and again, NATO members have praised Ukraine's armed forces for fending off Russia's attacks. But everybody also knows that this would not have been possible without Western support. Ukraine's allies, like the United States, Germany and the UK, have been sending more and more sophisticated kit to Kiev, like Leopard 2 tanks, Patriot air defense systems, or HIMARS rocket artillery vehicles. But what if the supply dries up? NATO leaders say that won't happen.
The war in Ukraine just demonstrates the need to stand with Ukraine and to continue to provide support.
But with the possible Donald Trump presidency looming over the US next year and top political figures in NATO member states such as Hungary publicly criticizing the Western approach to arming Ukraine, long-term backing from a united West is far from guaranteed. Meanwhile, the war will almost certainly continue to take a heavy toll on the wider world. If a carefully brokered deal on grain exports from Ukraine and Russia falls through, food prices could spike again, and that could see nations further afield pile pressure on the US and Europe to change course.
The future of the international order is heavily dependent on the global South. And countries in the global North and in the West need to understand that as much as they would like to see a unified global South or a unified Africa in support of their worldview, in support of their positioning on the Russian invasion of Ukraine, Western countries need to consider at what cost are they willing to potentially jeopardize their relations with Africa and the global South to pursue their own goals and aims when it comes to resolving the current crisis in Ukraine.
And what if there was a conflict over the Taiwan Strait? Such a scenario might lead to American resources and attention being redirected toward Asia and away from Ukraine. The result could be a stalemate and a frozen conflict in Ukraine. They exist all over the world. Think about North and South Korea, Transnistria, Nagorno-Karabakh, or even the Turkish occupation of northern Cyprus. That could leave Ukraine stuck in a grey area, knocking on the West door but finding nobody there willing to listen to their request or take them seriously. For now, that looks like an unlikely outcome, but it may only take a couple of elections or a spiking inflation crisis to see attitudes turn around in some parts of the Western alliance. Still, you can be sure Ukraine will keep pushing to be heard.
I'm literally coming to you from the country in war with two of my children remaining in Kiev while I'm here in Brussels. We do not want to be a hostage of a specific political leadership or a politicians who take the decision. We are standing and advocating for the momentum this decision should be taken, and this momentum is now.
But now is not the time are the words Kiev is more likely to hear, at least when it comes to joining NATO. For now, the war drags on, the suffering continues, and there is no end in sight. What we may see in future is some kind of combination of these three scenarios. Ukraine gets a perspective for NATO membership and some forms of security assurances for a transition period. But in the meantime, it finds itself having to fight on two very different fronts. Militarily to defend its territory against Russia and diplomatically to convince the West to continue its support in the long run. Seeing its flag raised here at NATO HQ is a dream for Ukraine. A dream that may come true eventually, but it seems not now and not in the next few years.